Welcome to Giant Monster Games, I'm Adrian, and today we are doing a $58 budget Merfolk Control deck. Now this actually plays closer to a Merfolk Tempo deck where we're controlling our opponent's game plan rather than controlling everything our opponent does, but that doesn't take away from the fact that we are controlling something when we play this deck. Now before we actually get into the deck, don't forget to vote for the next budget deck up in the right hand corner of this video. But enough mindless rambling for me, let's talk about creatures in order of converted mana cost. To start out with, we have Judge's Familiar. We're running 4 copies of this, and it is not a Merfolk, but it does have an amazing ability, which is why it's in the deck. Outside of the fact that it is a 1/1 flyer for 1, we can also sacrifice it at any time to counter an instant or sorcery spell unless our opponent pays 1 additional mana. Meaning our opponent now has to play around this card or get rid of it as soon as they can, which can really hinder our opponent's game plan and, as you can see, slows down their tempo because they're not going to be playing stuff on the turn they want. Our second and last 1-drop creature is 2 copies of Kazi's Trickster. Now this lady is really good against some decks and really bad against other decks, because whenever our opponent shuffles their library, she gets a 1/1 counter, which means against decks like Tron, she gets really big really fast because your opponent's constantly searching their deck. But against other decks like Mono Red Burn, she just never grows because your opponent's never shuffling their library, which comes back to the reason why there's only 2 of her in the deck. Moving into our 2-drop slots, we have 4 copies of Harbinger of Tides. Now this guy is fantastic because he plays into our control strategy. Whenever he enters the battlefield, we may return target tapped creature our opponent controls to their hand, which means against aggro decks that are trying to get a ton of damage in really quickly, we can just shoot those creatures back to our opponent's hand and then make them spend all their tempo recasting those creatures. Additionally, he has another ability, which means we can cast him for additional 2 generic mana and play him as though he had flash. So in the late game, when our opponent swings in with what they may assume be lethal, we can always bounce that back to our opponent's hand just for paying a 4 mana and getting a 2/2 creature while we do it. Our second 2-drop creature is 2 copies of Void Mage Prodigy. Now this guy's in here just to give us a bunch of extra control because he is kinda bananas. His ability is pay 2 blue mana, sacrifice a wizard, which we have 16 wizards in the deck, and counter target spell. The reason why this is so good is because it's not a spell we're playing, it's an ability, which means our opponent can't just counter our counter with a Remand or a Dispel or anything that your opponent would kinda have in their hand as a backup if they are trying to go off, say, in a combo deck. Moving into our 3-drop slots, the first creature we have is Cold-Eyed Silky. We're running 2 copies of this. Now this guy is kind of a double-edged sword because for starters it is a 1/1 creature for 3 mana, so that's pretty hard to swallow, but its upsides are pretty cool. For starters, it has Island Walk, which is actually very important, we'll talk about that more down the road, and secondly, whenever it does combat damage to a player, we draw cards equal to the amount of damage it did. Because we have a bunch of lords in this deck, he actually is generally drawing us like 2 or 3 cards whenever he does hit, so his upsides kind of make his downsides worth it. He's kind of like in that perfect middle ground area where he actually works quite well, and worst case scenario, he becomes a lightning rod and lets our opponent just kind of waste spells taking him out. Time to talk about our Merfolk Lords. We have 4 copies of Merfolk Sovereign and 2 copies of Merrow Regery. Now these guys are making all of our Merfolk bigger, which is fantastic, but they also both have relevant abilities. Merfolk Sovereign can make it so we can guarantee get damage into our opponent, and with cards like Cold-Eye Silky, we can guarantee draw some cards from that. And Merrow Regery can make it so we can tap down our stuff that our opponent might want to play, which again adds to our tempo-based control that this deck is really going for. Moving into 4-drops, we have 2 copies of Master of Waves. Now this guy is a definite win con for this deck. Why, you ask? Well, let me read off the card for you. For starters, he has protection from red, which means the bulk of creature removal that you'll see doesn't hit him. He's just protection from it, so Lightning Bolt, Terminate, can't touch him. Second of all, he makes all elemental creatures get +1/+1, which may not seem that relevant, but his last ability is when he enters the battlefield, you put X 1/0 elemental creatures into play equal to your devotion to blue. Because he makes elemental creatures bigger, they actually come into play as 2/1s as long as he's in play. Now something to note, if you haven't realized, almost every single creature in this deck has a mana cost of blue or 1 blue or just blue, which means there is a ton of devotion in this deck. Usually when you play this guy, you're actually getting 3, sometimes even 4 elemental creatures with him, which is huge. It means we go super wide and your opponent has a really hard time dealing with that. Now we don't have a ton of non-creature cards in this deck, so I'm just going to lump the rest of the cards into one big category called spells, starting off off with Seize Claim. We have 4 copies of this card, and it's doing a bunch of different jobs in this deck. The first one, and most obviously, is it's used to control the type of mana our opponent has. We can use it to break down Tron, or we can use it to slow down specific mana types that our opponent may have if we're playing against a deck that doesn't actually use blue mana. It also helps us facilitate our island walk, specifically with Cold Eye Silky, and it adds to Devotion, because usually once we play it, our opponent isn't going to spend the time to get rid of it, so it's multi-purpose. Next we have 3 copies of Mana Leak. It's always good to have some hard control in the deck, and this is kind of facilitating that role on the cheap. And lastly, we have 2 copies of Bident of Thassa, so because we have so many creatures in this deck, and we have Master of Waves, which is creating even more creatures for us, we're usually going to be getting through with a little bit of damage here and there, and this is just going to give us card advantage, which is going to allow us to get the advantage on our opponent, build up our tempo, and eventually close out the game so our opponent can't do anything because they're just not going to be able to outpace us. Also, this is giving us 2 Devotion just sitting on the table. And in a pinch, we can use its second ability where we can make our opponent's creatures attack us, so playing against decks like Soul Sisters where we really need to kill off the Soul Sisters, otherwise we're not going to be able to outpace them, we can just force them to attack in with the things that they probably don't want to attack in with. And our last 3 cards that are not lands fall into a category I call Backup Combo. That's right, we have an infinite combo in this deck as a backup win condition. Now what is this combo? It consists of Puresight Merrow, which we're running 4 of, Paradise Mantle, which we have 2 of, and Laboratory Maniac, which we are also running 2 of. The way the combo works is we have to have Laboratory Maniac in play because its ability is if we go to draw a card and our deck is empty, we win the game. So that's what we're trying to do. Next we have to have Puresight Merrow in play, and we have to equip Paradise Mantle onto it. Paradise Mantle basically turns any creature into a Birds of Paradise, allowing us to tap that creature for any color mana, adding it to our mana pool. And Puresight Merrow's ability is we pay a white or a blue, untap it, and we get a look at the top card of our library, and we may exile that card. So the way the combo works is we use Paradise Mantle to create mana, and then use that mana to pay to untap Puresight Merrow, and we just exile our entire library, so then when we go to draw a card, which could either be at the beginning of our next upkeep, or with one of the many ways we have of drawing cards, with either Bident of Thassa or Cold-Eyed Silky, we then draw a card and win the game because we don't have a library anymore. It's kinda janky, and it is super risky because there are so many pieces that our opponent can blow up with so many different cards, but it has won me games, and I'm sure it will win you games in the off chance that you use it. Okay, let's talk about lands now. The only special land we have is Nyktos Shrine of Nyx. We're only running 2 copies of this because it's really expensive, but it is such a necessary card for this deck. What it does is it allows us to pay 2 mana, tap it, choose a color, which in this case would be blue, and we gain mana equal to our devotion to that color. As I mentioned before, we get a ton of devotion in this deck, so it's not very hard for us to rack up 4 or 6 mana with just 1 land, which generally turns into the late game when we have Bident of Thassa in play and we're drawing a bunch of cards. We're just playing everything from our hand almost every single turn. This allows us to overwhelm our opponent and easily close out the game once we get to the late game. And lastly, we have 19 islands, nothing else too special in this deck. There are some other options, but we're going to keep it with this right now. Let's quickly jump over to our sideboard. For our counter magic package, we have 2 Ceremonious Rejection, 1 Dispel, and 2 Negate. Obviously, we can swap any of these in and out depending on what kind of decks we're going up against. We have 2 Echoing Truths, which we're using to deal with stuff like tokens or things that are just annoying that we can't deal with. Specifically larger creatures usually just bounce it to our opponent's hand. 2 Dissipation Fields. These are used in kind of mid to late game to deal with decks that are relying on aggro or relying on creatures because it just bounces those creatures back to your opponent's hand and they're not going to keep them. This gets really fun when you're playing against a control deck that's relying on using something like Celestial Colonnade to get through to damage. 1 copy of Gutshot. This is used to deal with small creatures or infect most commonly. 2 Tormod Script dealing with Dredge and other graveyard-centric decks. And lastly, the most interesting one in the sideboard is 3 copies of Tidebringer Mage. Now this card allows us to basically stall out any red or green deck that's relying on creature aggro, because when it comes into play, we get to tap down a red or green creature, and it doesn't untap as long as Tidebringer Mage is in play, meaning our opponent has to use up resources to take this off the battlefield, otherwise they just have a dead card in play. I don't need to list off the cards that you can use this for, because I'm sure you have a whole bunch of green and red creatures that are really annoying that you already know of. And that completes the entire budget Merfolk Control tempo combo deck, I guess. Before we actually end this video though, let's talk about some upgrades if you got some extra money to spend. First off, Curse Catcher is a general upgrade for Judge's Familiar because it also is a Merfolk, so it gets all the Lord benefits. Speaking of Lords, there's actually 2 other Lords that are generally better than the Lords we have in this deck. We have Master of the Pearl Trident and Lord of Atlantis. Both of these cards just generally are better than the 2 Lords we're running in this deck because they also give all of our Merfolk Island Walk, which means you should be running stuff like Spreading Seas, which is generally considered to be better than Seize Claim because it allows you to draw a card when you play it, so it just kind of replaces itself. Next, if you have some serious money to spend, we have Aether Vial. Exile. This allows you to cheat creatures in without actually having to pay their mana cost, and you can do it on your opponent's turn. So cards like Harbinger of Tides become way more difficult for your opponent to deal with, or cards like Judge's Familiar where you're using Aether Vial to bring it into play, so your opponent doesn't know that you actually have a type of counterspell basically in your hand. Next we have two upgrades in the way of lands. We have Mutavault and Cavern of Souls. Mutavault turns into a 2/2 creature, but it's also a land, so it fulfills two purposes. It gives you mana if you need it, and it turns into a 2/2 creature that is all creature types. So it can be a Merfolk in that case, so all of the benefits from our lords, it gets those as well. Cavern of Souls is really good because when it comes into play, you choose a creature type, and those type of creatures are uncounterable. So it basically makes it so your opponent can't just counter your stuff away as you're playing it, making this deck really, really strong and really hard to deal with. Assuming you're casting that creature with Cavern of Souls, that is. And that completes the entire deck. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Giant Monster Games. I'm Adrian, and don't forget to game like a giant monster.